Courage. I learned it from my adoptive mom. Hold my hand?
You hold my hand!
Learn about adopting a teen from foster care at adoptuskids.org. You can't imagine the reward. Brought to you by Adopt US Kids, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and the Ad Council.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Are President Biden's infrastructure talks with Republicans about to break down? And might that be a good thing for the GOP? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, WSJ columnists Kim Strassel and Bill McGurn. President Biden has been talking up Republican senators as he tries to make progress toward his $2.3 trillion infrastructure plan. More negotiations are supposed to be going on today, Friday. Yet the Associated Press reports today that White House hopes have cooled. And I'll read a line here from the AP story. It says, "The slog of the closed-door talks is certain to spark fresh worries from Democrats that time is slipping to strike a compromise. The president's team has set a soft Memorial Day deadline to determine if a deal was within reach," unquote. So, Bill, what do you make of this? It looks like there is one more week for these two sides to come together.
Yeah, well, let me say I'm hoping they don't come together because I don't see how Republicans can go along with this. The White House has reduced the overall spending amount, which is a good thing, but I haven't seen the details of what they're cutting out. I know some of the Republicans are insisting that, look, the infrastructure has to be limited to physical infrastructure, things we count like roads and bridges. But there are also other conditions on this spending, and would have to see that. It'd have to see, for example, I don't know what the fine print is about paying for it and whether it means changing the 2017 tax cut bill or any other kind of changes. And I think they may prove the real sticking points down the road.
And we also, I would add to that, we also don't have the Republicans' latest offer. So the two sides are still apart on that. Biden wants more than $2 trillion. Republicans, led by West Virginia Senator Shelley Moore Capito, previously offered about $570 billion. And so the White House now is reportedly frustrated that the GOP isn't going higher. The AP story quotes a source saying that the latest Republican offer is not a significantly changed offer. Republicans are saying they did increase their offer. Both of these are anonymous sources, so it's hard to know at this point. But Kim, it was notable that in fairness, Mitch McConnell this month said this. He said, "The proper price tag for what most of us think of as infrastructure is about $600 to $800 billion." So there's a little bit of a higher ceiling, it seems like.
I think the important thing that Mitch McConnell was signaling with that was that upper number, because when I talk to Republicans, that is the number, about $800 billion, at which they could keep their caucus together and provide votes for this. You get anything higher and you simply don't have Republicans agreeing to this anymore. I mean, there potentially certain individual Republican senators who might be willing to go along with something even more than that? Yes, maybe. But, one of the goals here, at least from the Republican side and from the Democratic side, is to have a bill that has true bipartisan support, that has, a majority of both parties. And so that 800 number is the sticking point. And it's why this latest offer from the White House is problematic, because all along, Republicans have not only said what their kind of top number is, but a couple of other things, too, that really matter to them. One is that this remains focused on actual infrastructure and, hard bridges and roads and other things that allow people to drive around and get around the country, et cetera. And as we've noted many times in our editorials, even $600 to $800 billion, if you go through that Biden proposal, is a stretch. So if the White House is coming back with $1.7 trillion, it means it's ignoring that GOP red line that it put out there. It's clearly demanding a bunch of money in this bill that's going to things that are not traditional infrastructure. And that strikes me as almost going out of its way to try to blow up these negotiations.
And the other thing that is probably a sticking point is the policy pieces of any infrastructure bill like this. And from the Republican side, I mean, I imagine that if Republicans are thinking about spending money on roads and bridges, they would want to do it with some kind of permitting reform bill to make sure that that stuff actually can get built in a timely fashion, make the jobs at least more shovel ready than they are currently. But it's hard for me to imagine anything like that bill getting through the progressive wing of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I think Joe Biden himself has made perfectly clear that his guiding principles are to make his proposals green, to transform the country in these green ways, to favor union contracts and make sure that the jobs created are union jobs, and to promote equity, which is not the same as equality, in in assigning contracts and so forth. And I think these are things that would be very hard for Republicans to accept. I don't think they should accept it. But those are the actual priorities of the Biden administration. If they propose building a bridge or a road, it's to accomplish these other things. And that's where I think the rubber is going to meet the road, not so much, even though it's important, on the top dollar value. But to me, these are far more important provisions than how many billion is spent, even though that's very important in itself.
Those union provisions are definitely top of mind for Biden and Democrats. And Kim, you wrote your column on Friday about this, and Biden essentially wants the infrastructure deal to include something called the PRO Act. Can you just give us a sense of what that means and what's in that proposal?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the PRO Act has been around for a couple of years now. House Democrats passed it last year. They passed it again in March. And what it is it's a bill that essentially eviscerates all the pro-worker laws we've had in the past, and instead hands all this power to unions to essentially force Americans into their ranks. So, one key example of this is it would nullify all 27 state right to work laws that we have right now, meaning you'd no longer have a choice about whether or not you had to pay union dues. It would strip companies of their rights to make their own case to employees about during unionization campaigns. It would give the NLRB a whole bunch more power over corporations, the ability to fine them outrageously if they were found in violation of labor provisions. So it's a union wish list. The problem the Democrats have is that it would take 60 votes to pass it in the Senate. They don't have 60. In fact, they only have 47 at the moment. They've still got 3 of their own senators who have yet to sign on to the bill. And also, this is a very policy-oriented bill, so it's unlikely to be one that you could pass through via budget reconciliation with 51 votes. So the White House's big strategy earlier this year was to try to tack it to a more popular piece of legislation, like infrastructure. And they went, so when they rolled out their infrastructure proposal, it didn't get a lot of attention, but the entirety of the PRO Act was tucked into that bill. There are Democrats right now making the argument in these negotiations that certain pieces of it need to be in there. But again, one of the problems is that the Republicans really reject most of these provisions. And I think that's another argument against why a negotiation gets done, because having kind of promised labor that this might be their best vehicle, if they came back with a bill that didn't really have any PRO Act provisions in it, big labor would have a meltdown.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street Journal.
Remember back in January when a group of Redditors drove up the price of GameStop?
It was discombobulating. It was disturbing. Like, what the hell is going on?
I'm Annie Minoff, and I also wanted to know what was going on. Since then, I've talked to dozens of people and learned the full story of how a Reddit forum fueled a massive stock surge. One that took Wall Street totally by surprise.
I should have known. Yes, I should have, but I did not.
Follow our 5-part series on The Journal, Sundays starting May 30th, wherever you get your podcasts.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Kim raises an interesting question here, because if Biden has assured his allies that there will be some sort of union provisions tacked on to this infrastructure bill, it seems to me that that creates a real sticking point, because that's a non-starter, I imagine, bill for a lot of Republicans. And yet then the question becomes, if they agree on a number, if they agree on 800 billion or whatever it is, will Biden accept an infrastructure deal without those kind of provisions, those kind of union provisions in it?
I find it hard, because I think that's what the progressive wing cares about even more than the substantive spending, which is a lot on the infrastructure. I think he's made it clear these are his goals. Advancing a greener America, a more unionized America, an America that decides things more on the basis of racial equity than equality. That's the principles of the left. And it's not getting enough attention in this focus on the bottom line, how many billion. So I'm hoping Republicans put it there. That's why I do not see what interest Republicans have in going along on this. We should have also learned from the 2009 stimulus bill, the idea that the government is good at all this stuff, is going to get it done. I think it's preposterous. Do we really think the government has so dramatically improved over the past few years that they can now spend this? It'll just be wonderful, and everything will go smoothly. There'll be no waste. That's a big leap of faith for someone like me.
And that's before we even get into the question of how to pay for all this. And Biden, of course, has proposed a series of tax increases. Kim, do you think that any of these are real red lines for Republicans?
Oh, definitely, for a number of Republicans. And they've been making the consistent case all along. And they have pretty much a great deal of unity on this, that any changes to the 2017 tax reform are a no-go. And so what we've been hearing instead is a discussion about whether or not you might impose a user fee, like a gas tax. The Biden administration has floated this notion that there might be money to be gained by stepping up IRS enforcement. I think both of these are really terrible ideas, especially politically. It's unclear why Republicans would want to put their fingerprints all over a very toxic thing like a gas tax. And as we've written about quite more than one time on the editorial pages, this notion that there is, up to $700 billion just hanging out there in new revenue from targeting the rich via a stepped up enforcement at the IRS is fanciful. Most of the studies note that much of the underreported income and evaded taxes is hidden in pass-through businesses. But, there's also plenty of information out there suggesting that a lot of the money that isn't being recouped is from, lower income Americans who are fiddling with, things like the earned income tax credit. So does anybody really want a stepped up IRS harassing everyone in the United States for potentially just fictional dollars? So we'll see where this goes. But I think Republicans, again, they don't want to touch the 2017 tax reform. They're arguing you could repurpose money that's already been spent out, but there doesn't seem to be any appetite from Democrats.
The IRS enforcement provision of this, I think, is interesting and hasn't gotten enough attention. This week, the Treasury Department issued a report essentially backing up that $700 billion number, saying that that's what they could bring in. And I think Kim raises a good point here, that the way this is being pitched by the president is we're basically going to do increased audits of Elon Musk's and Jeff Bezos's and people like that. But there's a lot of this money that is in small businesses and other places. And it's interesting, Bill, the Journal's news pages had a report on this and quoted a tax expert explaining this, that a lot of this money is in pass-through businesses. And here's what the tax expert says, quote, "This is a political call by the Biden administration. Let's not tell those guys, small business guys, what we're doing," unquote. And so it's pitched as enforcement on the rich. But Bill, it seems to me that it would affect a lot of people who are not Jeff Bezos's.
Yeah, I think that's who the majority would affect. It's sort of parallel to the idea of taxes, people that think they're always talking, we're going to tax the rich, we're going to soak them to get this money, and everyone knows that there's not enough money to do that in just the rich, however they define that you have to go down to the middle class. So people know when they say tax the rich, they're coming for you. As you point out, the real areas like undeclared income and so forth, the real areas where you might find this is much lower down with smaller businesses and what they define. And that's a very different kind of prospect than going after a few guys very much at the top to be harassing a lot of small businesses that don't have the margins, but they could be put through the ringer on this. So they're not going to emphasize that because they want to make this look, as you say, like it's going to be Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, but it's just as likely to be the little accountant around the corner from you or someone like that. That's if they're looking for revenue, that's where the money is.
And part of the way that the IRS would go about this increased enforcement is by using new information, new data that it would get from banks. And here's a line from the Treasury report on this enforcement issue this week. It says that financial institutions would be required to, quote, report gross inflows and outflows on all business and personal accounts from financial institutions, including bank, loan, and investment accounts, but carve out exceptions for accounts below a low de minimis gross flow threshold, unquote. So just to summarize that again, essentially banks would have to give the IRS information on the inflows and outflows of money into what would probably be millions of accounts, Kim. What do you make of that proposal?
Well, this is an extraordinary proposal in that it's a suggestion of a huge new level of intrusion. And I think it would actually even get to some very legitimate concerns about privacy. You could even end up with some lawsuits over this. But again, we have had politicians over the decades that always turn to this. They always argue, well, there's got to be some magic pot of money sitting out there that just is due to lax IRS enforcement and us not having enough information. But as with everything, there has to be a balance. We saw what happened 10 years ago when the IRS decided it was going to turbocharge its oversight of nonprofits and ended up targeting conservative nonprofits. You don't want a government that is monitoring every last thing that every American does. There's an element of freedom and privacy as well here too. And I think in the end, this is also the kind of proposal that Republicans would, because of that intrusive nature, reject out of hand. And all of this, again, bodes poorly for the idea that you can get to a negotiation and an agreement in the end. But I think it's something worth watching because Democrats are under their own pressure to not just keep borrowing and borrowing. There's a reality that even with all the vast numbers of tax increases that they have proposed, that it's still not enough money for their crazy spending plans. And so look for them to continue flagging this report and try to work it into their future spending proposals so that they can get away with claiming that they're going to recoup some of the dollars that are going out the door, even if it isn't true.
And it does seem to me, Bill, that every time the economy ticks upward again, Republicans get a little bit of a stronger argument that now is not the time to be putting another $2 trillion into the mix here. And Friday, here's the Wall Street Journal headline: U.S. jobless claims extend decline to new pandemic low. And there's still a lot of people continuing. Labor Department said continuing unemployment claims are 16 million, which is a lot, but it is down in a week from 16.9 million. So almost a million people in a week dropped off that. And Bill, what do you suppose the risk here is of Republicans getting on board for, even if it's only $800 billion of new spending, especially if we get some real inflation coming?
I think there's always a risk because politicians always hate opposing things they think might be popular. And if you're opposing a new road or something, they worry about that. But I think they have to look at the larger picture that Joe Biden is attempting a lot by his own by his own words, he's saying he wants to transform the country in a radically new and progressive direction. And I think as the bill starts coming due for these things, as we've seen in his policy elsewhere, on his decision on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, while he's killing the XL pipeline, I think a lot of Joe Biden's agenda is going to be much less popular when the cost and the implications are clear. For example, like the tax thing you mentioned, the price of doing what he's doing, he says invest in the IRS, is basically making a bigger, more intrusive and more fearsome IRS. I'm not sure people really want that. So why Republicans would jump on board now is beyond me. This agenda is not about American needs. It's about President Biden's political agenda, what he thinks he needs. He came in thinking, I'm going to sell Americans on the idea that I'm the one that's turned the economy around, fixed COVID and so forth. And the truth is, a lot of this stuff, the groundwork had been laid before him. And what he really had to do is sit back and just wait for it and so forth. All these things, as you say, it's kind of redundant now to be spending this money. And even some sort of Democratic people who might be friendly to this wonder about spending all this money now. Again, the criteria seems to be all the White House's determination of its political needs, not the country's economic needs.
But what about the counter risk? I mean, let's say that these negotiations break down and Biden and the Democrats use the Senate's budget reconciliation process to pass some sort of big infrastructure deal, and we go into the 2020 midterms. And that's going to be a huge part of the debate. And Kim, no doubt, Biden and Democrats are going to say this is why you can't put Republicans back in charge of the House or the Senate, because they are obstructionists. They don't want to build those bridges. They don't want to build those roads. Do you think they can make that argument stick?
Well, that's exactly what Obama tried to do in 2010. After Republicans pushed back on his enormous stimulus bill and also Obamacare. And it was absolutely a failed argument because, in fact, the politics of this can quite easily work the other way. If we've got inflation, if we've got all this money that went out the door and Democrats own it entirely, then the Republican argument would be, as it was in 2010, you need to put us in power to act as a stop sign on this wild Democratic Congress that is blowing the bank and proposing all kinds of radical legislation. So that's the argument against, by the way, doing an infrastructure deal, because if Democrats are going to go this large and not care about what it does to taxes or inflation or the economy or debt in the future generation, then let them own it. Don't put your fingerprints on it. Now, the argument against that, which is just interesting because I've been hearing it from some Republicans, is there are some Republicans that are of the view that Democrats really want this infrastructure bill because it might be the only thing they could get done. And that, remember, they only have 50 votes in the Senate. Nancy Pelosi has a narrow margin in the House. And you've still got a lot of different senators and members on the Democratic Party in the House that all have issues with different pieces of this legislation. Stimulus, I mean, the infrastructure is the most popular piece of it. You take that out and pass it in a bipartisan deal and it's not there anymore. Can you really get your coalition to come together for 51 votes on everything else? Not entirely clear. Now, I'm not convinced of that. I think Democrats have been very good about strong arming their members into doing anything they want. But that's what some Republicans are thinking as they continue with these negotiations.
And the other dynamic here, last thought, is that Biden and the Democrats have also not said that if they get a deal with Republicans, they won't come back later through reconciliation and get the rest of what they want. And so, Bill, it seems to me that if you're making the argument for Republican compromise, you could say an $800 Republicans should do an $800 billion deal to head off essentially a $2.3 trillion deal, which they think is too much, head off some of the tax increases that are required to pay for that. But it seems to me it lowers their incentive to do any sort of deal if Biden says, I'll take your $800 billion, and then I'll come back later for the other 1.5 trillion.
Yes, on policy grounds alone, if they do that, and I think that's exactly what the Biden administration will do, Republicans lose everything. A compromise is meant to be give and take, and you achieve something. But in this case, if they're just going to give a little now, the Democrats, and take it back in another bill, there's no compromise at all. All you do is give Joe Biden some credit for working with Republicans, which is really done in bad faith. So again, I don't see the Republican incentive to go along on this. I think that the Republicans are better placed to make their stand now. And I think wait to see how some of this stuff is going to be greeted by the public. I do not think it's going to be as popular as the Democrats are banking on.
Thank you, Kim and Bill. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.